Hi, the recent war against Iran raised a lot of interesting questions. Among those questions is the question of Saudi Arabia. What kind of military power does Saudi Arabia have? And what could Saudi Arabia do if it were to actively join in the or a war against Iran? Of course, the single most important thing the Saudis could do, which they actually did, was to let Americans use their airspace and to let Americans use their own facilities like Saudi bases within Saudi Arabia. This was a tremendous advantage to the Saudi military, to the American military. So that alone was probably the single greatest contribution the Saudis could make, and it's something that the Saudis did actually do. By the way, the Saudis did not, as far as I know, allow Israeli aircraft to enter or go through Saudi airspace. So the question is, what if the Saudis were to get more involved in the war? This is a really interesting question because on one hand, at least on paper, Saudi Arabia is a military giant. It's got the largest, most powerful, on paper, military in the Arab world, one of the largest militaries really in the world. They spend a gigantic sum of money on its military. The numbers that I've been seeing when I did my research were about like $78 billion. That's more than France, it's more than Britain. And yet, it seems like the Saudi military is that the whole is somehow less than the sum of the parts, and it has a fairly bad reputation. Is this reputation justified? And if it is even true, how? How do you explain spending as much as $80 billion a year on a military that doesn't seem to be particularly useful? So I want to get into that in this video. For those of you who are new here, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this kind of content, hit like and subscribe. Also, please check out the book that I recently published on Amazon, The French Way of War. I think it's pretty interesting and nifty, and it'll help open your eyes to a lot of what I've been talking about really over the course of this channel. Let's get into it. As I often do with these longer videos, I divide it into several parts, and I put a timestamps in the description below so you can kind of jump around in these parts. So part one is going to be like an interview, the size of the Saudi military, the structure, who serves, how much money do they spend, that kind of thing. Part two, what is the Saudi military designed to be able to do? Part three, the Army and the National Guard. They have an Army and a National Guard, which are very similar in structure, but have very different missions. Part four, the Saudi Air Force. Part five, the Saudi Navy. And then part six, the Strategic Missile Force. Yes, they have one. Part seven, Saudi air defense capabilities. And part eight, sort of like a conclusion, what could the Saudis contribute to the Iran war if they were to become actively involved in the or a Iran war? Part one, overview. The Saudi military, officially called the Saudi Arabian Military Forces, totals approximately 400,000 active duty personnel. That's a lot of people. It technically has 5 branches, but in reality, there's also a 6th, maybe even a 7th if we include the Royal Guard. But the 6th is, as we shall see, under an entirely separate command. So what are they? We have the Royal Saudi Land Forces, that's the Army, the Royal Saudi Air Force, the Royal Saudi Naval Forces, the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces, and the Royal Saudi Strategic Missile Defense Force. And then there's the Saudi Arabian National Guard, which is a separate parallel military, which again we'll discuss a little bit further in below. Global Firepower, which is one of those websites that ranks militaries, take it for what it's worth, which is not a lot, but they rank Saudi Arabia 25th in terms of overall military power. In the Arab world, it's number 1. Now, part of this is just money. In 2025, Saudi Arabia spent as much as $78 billion. To put that in perspective, this is the 5th largest defense budget on earth. In 2024, SIPRI said that it spent actually $80.3 billion. Again, a lot. As a percentage of GDP, Saudi Arabia spends approximately 7.1% of GDP, 7.1 to 7.3%. This is among the highest ratios in the world, behind Ukraine, Russia, and Israel. Defense spending represents 21% of the entire Saudi government budget. Now, this wasn't always the case. As you can see here in these charts that I'm putting on the screen, Saudi Arabia really didn't start spending big bucks on defense until 1973, when, thanks to the OPEC's oil embargo because of the Yom Kippur War, this brought enormous sums of money into the Saudi budget. And then through the 80s and 90s and the GWAT, right, 9/11, they just started spending a lot of money, with a peak at 2015 with the start of the Yemen war. And throughout all this period, the Saudis were spending as a percentage of GDP well above global norms. The armed forces are voluntary, but it's not open to everyone. You have to join the regular military, you have to be a Saudi born, and the son and grandson of Saudis. Women have been permitted to serve in the Saudi military as of 2018. In practice, there are actually significant numbers of foreign military personnel that fill out the Saudi ranks. They're not in the regular Saudi Army officer corps. There are tens of thousands of Pakistanis serving in various advisory and technical roles. During the Yemen war, for example, the Saudi coalition ground forces relied on Sudanese, Colombian, and locally hired Yemeni forces. Separately, there are over 1,000 U.S. and several hundred British military personnel serving in training and advisory missions inside Saudi Arabia at any given time. Part 2. What is the Saudi military designed to be able to do? Saudi Arabia does not have any published white papers that would explain their vision for what their defense is supposed to do, unfortunately. It was really, defense doctrine apparently is set by the Saudi royal family, and it's all considered classified. But you can infer all sorts of things from the strategic logic, from the force structure and where they put the military, what kind of military, etc. One can infer that the Saudi military really has 4 separate missions. First, deter and defend against Iran, principally. This is the organizing principle of the entire force. The second mission that the Saudi military has is to defend the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. These, of course, are irreplaceable political and religious assets for the Saudi kingdom. In the background of all this is 1979, when there was an extremist group that attacked the Mecca and seized it, and then there was a siege that the Saudi government had put down. This is rather traumatic, I would say, for the Saudi royal family, something that they've never really forgotten. The third mission of the Saudi military is to maintain internal stability. The Saudi Arabian National Guard, which is separate from the military, it answers to a separate ministry, largely exists for this purpose. It's to protect the royal family and to suppress internal dissent. The fourth mission of the Saudi military is to project limited regional influence. The key thing here is this Yemen intervention, which began in 2015 and is still technically ongoing. This is Saudi Arabia's most ambitious attempt to shape the neighborhood by force. The results have been mixed, to put it charitably, which we're going to get a little bit into. What the Saudi military is not really designed to be able to do is to project power far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. There's no aircraft carrier, there's no strategic airlift, there's no over-the-horizon expeditionary doctrine. This is a military built for the defense of the homeland and not for fighting wars far from home. Part 3, the Saudi Army and the National Guard. The Royal Saudi Land Forces, or the RSLF, which is the Saudi Arabia's army, fields approximately 75,000 active duty personnel, which is really quite large. It makes it smaller than France's, but it's still pretty hefty. It is a conventionally designed maneuver force designed to do conventional peer-on-peer warfare, kind of in an American style. It has 3 armored brigades, it has 5 mechanized brigades, 1 airborne brigade, and 8 artillery battalions, and all of this is spread across 8 geographic regional commands that cover the entire country. Its tank fleet is very large on paper. It has over 1,000 vehicles, but the quality varies enormously. The frontline force consists of about 600 M12S Abrams tanks, making Saudi Arabia the 3rd largest Abrams tanks user behind the United States, of course, and Egypt. They also, however, have a large number of older machines. For instance, they have 370 M60 Patton tanks. These are Cold War era Vietnam era American tanks, 1970s, plus 140 French AMX 30s, which are largely in storage. In November 2025, the United States approved the sale of 300 new M1A2. These are SEP V3 Abrams to replace the M60 fleet entirely. The SEP V3 apparently comes with the Trophy Active Protection Service, which I find kind of interesting because that's basically Israeli tech, but whatever. About those M60s, the M60, a lot of nations actually use M60s, or a lot of them, but what many nations have done is they've thoroughly modernized the M60s in order to keep them useful. So I think the leaders in this field are the Israelis, who have modernized the M60 and called it the Magash. They put a Merkava-like turret on it and a powerful engine and more powerful gun and more powerful electronics, et cetera, just make it much more useful. And the Israelis value this, knowing that, okay, you don't use this as your frontline tank-on-tank thing, but it's still actually very useful in certain roles. So it's good to have them around. The Turks have a variant of the Israeli modernized M60. It was the Israelis modernized it. It's called the Sabra, M60 Sabra. And then the Turks now have a new iteration of the Israeli modernized one. Now what they've done is they've sort of taken away some of the Israeli tech and put on more Turkish tech. The Greeks, I believe, also have a variant of the Israeli thing. I'm not entirely sure. The point is that you can take an M60 and you can modernize it so that it's not as ridiculous as it sounds, like to be going to war in a 1970s era tank. However, the Saudis have not actually done this. The M60s that the Saudis have not really been meaningfully modernized the way the Israelis and the Greeks and the Turks have done. One reason for this that I've read is that the Saudis don't really buy into the idea of sort of the value proposition of this, that because maybe their culture, it makes more sense to splash out a lot more money on something new rather than to invest money in something old. So the value proposition that a modernized M60 represents is kind of lost on Saudis. They're not really interested. The other reason why the Saudis haven't done this is that they've been so intent on buying more M1 Abrams that they always assumed, why spend money on the M60s when soon enough we're going to get new M1s and we're going to be able to get rid of all the M60s. Arguably, this was a mistake because the Saudis have been using their M60s and I think suffering from the fact that these things have not been modernized. So, for example, they've used a lot of these in Yemen, and the Houthis with whom they've been fighting have figured out that it's relatively easy to deal with the M60s. And the more modern M60 would be more survivable. As for artillery, the RSLF operates M109A6 Paladin self-propelled howitzers. They also have Brazilian Astros II MLRS systems with ranges up to 90 kilometers, and the American M270 MLRS. Of note, the Saudis have large numbers of American and Canadian infantry fighting vehicles, including 400 Bradleys, 700 LAV-25s or LAV-3s, and they also have 470 old French AMX-10P. I've often wondered if the French regret getting rid of their own. And they've ordered 900 LAV-700s. The LAV-700s are more modern, more highly protected versions of the older LAVs that they already have. Now, to be clear, I have discovered that the sources writing about the Saudi LAV-700 procurement, it's all very contradictory and often lacking in precision. I was not able to figure out, was it the Saudi army that's buying these things? Was it the Saudi National Guard that's buying these things? And then there's also this thing called the Royal Guard, and some of the sources I read said it was the Royal Guard that was buying the LAV 700s and not the National Guard or the army. It doesn't really make sense for the Royal Guard to have 900 LAV 700s, but whatever, that's what I read. If you happen to know, have information about this, please feel free to share it in the comments. I would actually really appreciate the clarity. The Saudi land forces also operate 22 Apaches, by the way, with another 25 on order or being remanufactured to bring the total to just under 50. Saudi also has a variety of other helicopters that can use night attack modes, including the AH-6 Little Birds. The National Guard, or the Saudi Arabian National Guard, the SANG, is the other Saudi army. It's genuinely a separate army with a separate chain of command. It answers to its own ministry, has its own budget. It's just totally different. It's larger than the army, in fact. It fields approximately 100,000 full-time personnel plus another 28,000 tribal irregulars. One thing that makes it different from the army is that they don't have any really heavy things. So they have the LAVs, a lot of LAVs, but they don't have any heavy tanks, and they don't have the AMX-10Ps, the tracked vehicles. Now, you have to ask, what is the point of having two armies? And I think this is one of the more important structural facts about the Saudi military, and one of the reasons why the Saudi military is considered less capable than the United Arab Emirates military, even though it's much larger. And also why, as I said earlier, it seems that the whole of the Saudi military is worth less than the sum of the parts, notwithstanding the fact that they spend enormous sums of money on the military. So the idea of having two armies, it's not redundancy. It's really all about coup-proofing. Coup-proofing is a term that people use to describe things that authoritarian governments do to their militaries in order to ensure that the military itself is not actually a threat. In this case, the Saudis have created a force that they believe is more loyal, or that the loyalty of which is more certain, that stands between them and the Saudi army and makes it more difficult, because if any one part of the Saudi army were to decide to have a coup, they know that, among other things, they have to contend with the National Guard, which is large enough and capable of enough force to keep them from, in an all-out war between the two forces, the Saudi army would probably win, but the National Guard means that you can't just do something easily and quickly. The problem with coup-proofing, the price that you pay is in military effectiveness, and this brings us to Yemen. The Yemen experience and its lessons in many ways is very telling about some of the structural problems. It reveals some of the problems about the Saudi military. When the Saudis invaded in March 2015, when they kicked this off, the stated plan was to do a quick 6-week campaign to defeat the Houthis and to restore the Houthi government. To restore the Hadi government. That was 11 years ago. Their campaign flew over 26,000 sorties. These are Saudi F-15s and Typhoon struck Houthi positions across Yemen. But Saudi pilots, among other things, they flew at a very high altitude to avoid ground fire, which improved their survivability, but also destroyed the accuracy. Schools and hospitals and weddings got hit. The Houthis really didn't buckle, they didn't care, and on the ground things were really problematic. The Saudis proved to be incapable of sealing their own 900-mile border with Yemen, and they lost more than 50 M60 Patton tanks, knocked out mostly by Iranian-supplied Cornet anti-tank missiles fired from concealed positions. They also lost 20 Abrams tanks, and this got people's attention because these things, it's stupid to think that any tank is invulnerable, but 20 Abrams is really big deal. The Houthi fighters were also able to infiltrate Saudi border territory and overrun positions and briefly occupy Saudi villages. The root cause, from everything I read, isn't about the equipment, it's about the doctrine and the culture. The officer corps apparently is shaped by patronage and political loyalty, not merit. Promotions come from connections to the royal family, not battlefield competence. Commanders don't take the initiative because the initiative is dangerous in this sort of patronage system. Failure is punished, success is not rewarded. Intelligence wasn't shared up the chain of command because in this kind of environment, information hoarding is how you protect your own position relative to everybody else. So as a result, combined arms integration suffers and joint integration suffers. And all of this, in effect, was chronically weak because no single commander was allowed to control too many assets. These are structural problems. These are not things you can fix by buying more stuff or hiring a lot of Western trainers, though Saudi Arabia has done plenty of this. The only real solution is to change the military culture, to give the military genuine institutional autonomy, merit-based promotions, empower the NCOs, to decentralize the initiative. These are all the sorts of things that, in comparison, the United Arab Emirates appear to have done a better job with. They have focused more on that kind of thing, and according to most of the analysts I read, it's paid dividends, and this is part of what makes the United Arab Emirates force, although smaller, ultimately more effective. So pound for pound, it's a more effective force than the Saudi military, which outweighs it by many, many pounds. Poor ability among the Saudis to do combined arms combat is supposedly one of the reasons why the Saudis lost as many M1 tanks as they did. They did not use them properly with dismounted infantry, and they put them in areas in which they were vulnerable without having that infantry. So it's not the machine, it's how you use the machine. It's the doctrine. And this is a common problem that one finds. This brings us to part 4, which is the Air Force. This is where the picture becomes significantly more positive. The Royal Saudi Arabian Air Force is the most credible branch of the Saudi military, and by most measures, the most capable air force in the Arab world. It fields 914 total aircraft, making it the 6th most powerful air force globally in terms of overall strength. Saudi Arabia operates 127 F-15C and S aircraft and 85 of the newer F-15 SA variant. SA supposedly stands for Saudi Advanced, which together makes it the second largest operator of F-15s after the United States. The F-15SA is considered one of the most capable of the F-15 variants ever built because of the radar it's got, the fly-by-wire flight controls, and compatibility with the full catalog of American air-launched weapons. And yes, the Saudi stuff all has the Link 16 networking, like data hubs, I guess you could describe these. These are things that allow Saudi aircraft to talk easily with one another, to share data with ground stuff, and also to share data with CENTCOM and American and other coalition forces that also have Link 16. Alongside the F-15s are 71 Eurofighter Typhoons. These are Tranche 2 aircraft. These are excellent in air-to-air combat, and they are increasingly capable in air-to-ground operations. Rounding that out, they have 81 Tornado strike aircraft, which apparently are being retired as the A-15SA fleet expands. As for enablers, very critically, the RSAF operates 5 E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft. These are of incredible importance, particularly given the size and the scale of the country, and it gives them an important early warning capability. And also, from what I understand, the Saudi AWACS planes are fully plugged into the American CENTCOM's net. So like they feed into the intelligence network. This is another example of a way in which the Saudis and the Israelis quietly cooperate militarily, because to the extent that both Israel and the Saudis plug into the CENTCOM's intelligence and information networks, they're actually cooperating and sharing information with one another, which is useful for things like incoming ballistic missile strikes from Iran. The Saudis also have 8 KE-3A aerial refueling tankers. It's very important, provides real power projection capabilities for the fighter fleet. They also have 35 C-130 Hercules for tactical airlift. Notably absent, the Saudis do not have any strategic airlift above the C-130, so they don't have any C-17 equivalents in the Saudi inventory. The Royal Saudi Air Force's reputation is substantially stronger than that of the Army. I think, according, again, from what I read, this is just for a structural reason. Aviation demands individual and technical competence that you just can't fake. And a pilot who can't fly will die regardless of how connected he is to the royal family. Saudi pilots, they undergo rigorous training, selection. They spend a lot of time with U.S. and British instructors. And the Royal Saudi Air Force reportedly has a fairly high operational readiness rate. So this is really good. There is a key vulnerability, which is that the Saudi Air Force and actually much of the military is dependent on foreign contract people for maintenance. Somewhere between 50 to 60% of the Royal Saudi Air Force aircraft maintenance is performed by American, British, and French contractors rather than Saudi technicians. In a serious conflict where the Western governments, for whatever reasons, decide to limit support to the Saudi military, this can be a real problem. And apparently it happened during the Yemen war, when at some point Western countries got all sort of uncomfortable about what the Saudis were doing in Yemen against the Houthis. So it's a vulnerability, and this is another reason. This is a reason why the Saudis, in the document called Vision 2030, which is kind of as close as you can get to a Saudi white paper, put a lot of focus on trying to develop an indigenous technical industrial capability and indigenous maintenance capability so that they are less reliant on foreign contractors and also on foreign suppliers in general. In the current context of the war against Iran, the Saudi Air Force's performance in March 2026 has been excellent. They've intercepted wave after wave of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles. They've done a really very good job. But always remember that intercepting operations, defense operations, are way easier than doing something active, like actually penetrating Iranian airspace and attacking ground targets. That's a whole other thing. And thus far, the Saudi Air Force remains untested in that. I mean, they did it in Yemen, but the Yemen airspace was completely undefended, whereas with Iran, as you've seen, the Iranians still have some capability of defending their airspace. Part 5, the Navy. The Royal Saudi Navy forces are a medium-sized regional navy organized around 2 completely separate fleets. There's a Persian Gulf fleet, and then there's the Red Sea fleet. Now, a lot of these videos, when I talk about navies, I like to imagine sort of a spectrum of, you've got like the Alfred Thayer Man blue water fleet designed for fleet battles, decisive battles against enemy fleets. That's kind of the American model. And then at the opposite extreme, you have a je ne sais quelle kind of littoral defense based on speedboats, torpedo boats, small submarines. It's all about literal stuff, fast moving things that are much more cheaper, that are much cheaper than the larger vessels. You have no ambition for the blue water fleet, knowing that you're not going to survive in a blue water context against the larger navies, but who cares? And particularly with modern weaponry, the modern anti-ship missile and even anti-tank missiles, which are very, very effective against many kinds of ships. Small boats are more lethal and more effective than they've really ever been before. Now, the Saudis end up being somewhere in the middle, in that they have this medium-sized force that is geared towards protecting Saudi Arabia and the coast and its infrastructure and its oil industry, but does so with the mix of kind of medium and smaller fleets. The contrast is really only more meaningful if you compare with, say, with the Iranian Navy. The Iranian Navy I have described in the past as being much more of a je ne sais kind of fleet. It's the small boat, the missile boat, that kind of thing. The Saudis have some of that, but they also have some larger warships. The Saudi fleet apparently totals approximately 29 to 34 warships. I found different numbers. And part of the answer to that depends on how you count the auxiliaries. The most capable of the vessels are the three Al Riyadh class frigates. These are French-built Lafayette class or Lafayette derived frigates built in the period between 2002 and 2004. They're designed primarily for anti-air warfare, which makes sense for Saudi trying to think about the Iranian threat. These are genuine ocean-going warships that have been used to enforce the blockade against Yemen since 2015. Behind those are four older Al Madina class frigates from the 1980s. There's a new generation of Avante 2200 corvettes being built by Spain that came online between 2022 and 2024. These are useful. The most consequential new addition are four multi-mission service combatants. These are MMSCs, they're called, built by Fincantieri in the United States. The first was launched in December 2025, and deliveries are expected through 2026 and 2028. Saudis have no submarines. Also, I need to bring up mines. The Iranians use mines, which we've all seen in terms of the headlines. The Iranians use mines extensively in the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia does have a countermine capability in the form of three aging British Sandown-class countermine vessels, which are based in the Persian Gulf, naturally. These are good, but they are old, and most importantly, there are only three of them to cover a very, very long coastline and a very significant mining threat. Saudis also apparently have no helicopter-borne countermine capabilities, and the Saudi Navy has not, from what I read, invested in unmanned countermine systems. So the honest characterization, as I said, the Saudis are somewhere in the middle between the Alfred Thayer Man and the je ne sais models. You have ultimately a littoral navy, but with ambitions. So arguably it's well suited for its core mission, which is controlling the Persian Gulf approaches and the Red Sea to the extent possible, and protecting Saudi export terminals and enforcing a blockade. Part 6, the Strategic Missile Force. Saudi Arabia does maintain a separate force called the Royal Saudi Strategic Missile Force, entirely independent of the regular army and air force, and it reports directly to the king. This has been described as Saudi Arabia's nuclear-adjacent deterrent capability. Even though Saudi Arabia does not possess nuclear weapons yet, it's sort of like a way of saying, well, if we had them, we could use them because we have the missiles already that would work with these things. The primary system is the Chinese-supplied DF-3A intermediate range ballistic missile. They have a range of about 4,000 kilometers. But it could hit every city in Iran, more or less. The Saudis also have the more modern Chinese DF-21 medium-range ballistic missile with a range of about 2,000 kilometers. About these DF-3 and DF-21 missiles, these are not precision weapons, although some of the more modern variants of the DF-21 apparently have what might be described as precision capabilities, but apparently, reportedly, allegedly, the Saudis don't actually have those versions. So these are crude missiles that you can point at a city. You might be able to point at a large complex like a harbor or a port or maybe a large refinery, but you can't target any specific building in any given city or port or terminal or anything like that. You just sort of throw it in the general direction. You chuck it and kind of hope for the best. They have large conventional warheads, but not super large. Why? What is the point of this? And I do find this really interesting. Why have these things? If you're chucking them at refineries, I think they could be devastating. If you're chucking them at cities, ultimately they only have a terror effect. You use it to terrorize the local civilian population, but it doesn't have any real military effect. And the military effectiveness of terrorizing civilian populations by throwing bombs at them is hardly debatable, to say the very least. I mean, look at what the Germans did to England, and it just, if anything, it unified the Brits against Germany. So what's the point? Well, one thing is, okay, so it's one ability. The idea is like, okay, Iran, if you throw missiles at us, we can throw missiles at you and we can kill a lot of your people. But also, allegedly, or from what I read, there's the implied notion that, well, we could get nuclear weapons, especially if you, Iran, get nuclear weapons. And once you put a nuclear weapon on one of these things, this is a total game changer. A nuclear weapon doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to be precise. It doesn't matter if you can't target a single building in the city because you're going to blow up the entire city. So it's a limited conventional deterrent, but it's a promise of more. It's almost an implied threat of more. Go nuclear, we can go nuclear, and we already have the missiles to use. All right, air defense. If there's one area the Saudis, I think, genuinely have a world-class capability, it is with air and missile defense. We've seen this in the last month. The Saudis have done an excellent job of taking down Iranian drones and missiles. Of course, some get through, but some will always get through. But by and large, they've done really great. The Saudi air defense capability is unsurprising because this is the kind of thing where the more money you spend, often the better you get. In this case, what the Saudis have been able to do is they've been able to splash out a ton of money to build a multi-tiered integrated air defense system based primarily on high-end American kit, and it works. So at the top of the stack is the THAAD, the THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. The full build-out envisions 7 THAAD sites across the country with 4 active in early 2026. THAAD fills the gap at the extreme altitude that even the Patriots cannot reach. And of course, the Saudis have lots of Patriots. They have 6 battalions or 108 Patriot launchers operating a mix of PAC-2 GEM-T and PAC-3 MSE interceptors. I don't know what those are, but presumably they're faster than the Nimbus 2000. In January 2026, Saudi Arabia ordered 730 additional interceptors in a $9 billion package. The Saudis also have NASAMS and Orlikon Sky Chill systems for low altitude threats, drones, cruise missiles, helicopters, and the like, and is actively expanding its point defense capabilities with what they call CRAM around critical infrastructure. Connecting all of this is something called the Peace Shield Network. It's a command and control architecture built originally by Boeing in the 1980s, and it's integrating all of this stuff. So the THAAD and the Patriot and the NASAMS, etc., and linking it with the fighter squadrons and the AWACS and all that kind of good stuff. This is what makes the Saudi Arabian air defense system a system rather than just a collection of individual batteries. So here the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. One critical vulnerability that the Saudis have is the same as everybody else, which is that while they have plenty of launchers, the interceptors themselves are finite. There's a finite quantity of them. And the ability of Lockheed Martin and the other American firms to build these things is also limited, and these things are in demand. There's a real danger that the Saudis, like everybody else, could run out of these interceptors really very soon. So this is a problem that no amount of wealth can quickly solve. I mean, unless you have to expand the capacity, production capacity, but that takes a while, and that's a very large endeavor. Part 8, what could Saudi Arabia contribute to an Iran war? Saudi Arabia's posture has evolved fairly quickly. In January, Saudi Arabia told Tehran that Saudi airspace would not be open for American strikes. But by late March, Saudi Arabia quietly reversed course and agreed to let the U.S. forces go through Saudi Arabia and to use the King Fahd airbase. Iran responded by striking the U.S. embassy compound in Saudi Arabia, destroying a U.S. E-3 AWACS at a Saudi base. Saudi Arabia is already functionally in the war, whether the Saudis declare it or not. But what if it wanted to do more? Well, again, the most important thing the Saudis could possibly do is something they've already done, which is to open up their bases to the Americans. The second most valuable thing that the Saudis offer is their integrated air defense network. The Saudis are already doing this. Also, we have the intelligence provided by the Saudi E-3 Sentry aircraft in terms of radar coverage, etc. This benefits the U.S., this benefits Israel. This is very useful. Let's move on, though. Let's move on. We have air combat capabilities. I think that's the next thing that the Saudis okay, so basing they've already done. The intelligence and AWACS and all that, the Saudis have already been contributing. The next thing that they could do, but haven't already done, is contributing Saudi air power. This would be useful. The Saudi F-15s and Typhoons could contribute significantly to the air war. One way they could do it is by doing more combat air patrol stuff, freeing up U.S. assets for deep strike missions. But they could also participate in the deep strike missions. They could participate in the suppression of Iranian air defenses. There's also, I would say, financial contribution. Trump already has floated the idea of Saudi Arabia and the other Arab states for paying for the war, which he specifically invoked the 1991 model, where Saudi Arabia contributed as much as $55 billion to the overall war effort. Paying for a war that destroys your primary strategic threat while avoiding the political human cost of getting involved directly is, from Riyadh's perspective, perhaps a bargain. So maybe that's going to happen. What the Saudis really can't contribute is a meaningful ground force. And I haven't read anybody seriously contemplating this, like imagining the Saudis committing some of their mechanized armored brigades to any kind of land war in Europe. I mean, in Iran. The Iranians simply can't do this. I mean, the Saudis simply can't do this. They don't have the capability. They don't have the track record. Conclusion: how good is the Saudi military? The answer is, as most things involved with Saudi Arabia, is it depends on what you're asking it to do. Its air defense network is world-class and battle-proven. Its air force is very good, among the best in the Arab world, certainly, and certainly a genuine regional power. Its navy is capable and modernizing. All of this is large and expensively well-equipped. They've got lots of great tech, but arguably a lot of it is undermined by coup-proofing and patronage. And patronage culture, in which promotion is more about political connections rather than your actual capabilities. The loss of Saudi Abrams tanks to Houthi anti-tank missiles is evidence that what money buys you is not that important when the doctrine and the culture lag behind the hardware. So buying really nice kit is not sufficient for having an effective military. It's formidable on paper. It's not useless or inept. I mean, it has some real capabilities. It certainly has credible air defense capabilities and air power, but it's fragile at the sharp end of ground combat. And I go back to the comparison that I've read between Saudis and the UAE, where the Saudi has a long but dull spear, whereas the UAE has a small but very sharp spear tip. It's a crude metaphor, but let's go with it. If you found this analysis useful, hit subscribe and comment. Please check out my book, available on Amazon, and I will see you in the next video. There's plenty more in the pipeline. Bye-bye, and thank you.